I bid you welcome.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
How do you like that, eh?
Even a man who's pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright.
I love dead. Hate living.
It's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters.
I bid you welcome to a new world of gods and monsters. My name is Ian Bates, and I'm the founder and content curator of the Universal Studios Monsters account on Instagram. I'd like to invite you on a journey, both timeless and full of horror. This is the Monster Archives, or what I like to refer to as the unofficial audio history of the Universal Studios Monsters. There are plenty of fantastic and fascinating podcasts available on the subject of classic horror films and the iconic monsters we all know and love. But I wanted to do something a bit different, something with some structure that dives deep into the massive history and lore of the universe that Universal Studios crafted throughout the 1920s to the 1950s and beyond. Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Bride of Frankenstein, the Phantom of the Opera, Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Invisible Man, icons of horror in their own right, instantly recognizable around the globe as the monsters. Horror wouldn't be what it is today without these timeless characters and the nearly countless films they inhabited. What is it that continues to enrapture fans and audiences with a series of films that began over a century ago? It's the monsters themselves, the humanity of the characters. Whether undead or cursed, insane or evolved, we see a reflection of ourselves in the eyes of these monsters. That's what sets them apart from so many others. There are a few properties that have stood the test of time in the same manner as Universal's monsters. Generations have passed by, and people, both young and old, continue to watch, enjoy, study, and live out these films. The fan base for these films are dedicated and passionate as ever. The legacy the monsters have paved is truly something to behold and honor. The horror genre was paved by a group of pioneering filmmakers, screenwriters, actors, and filmgoers taking chances on a subject matter that is certainly unconventional to enjoy. The macabre fascinates and delights most of us. We can't explain this unnatural draw, yet it is the one thing that never seems to go away. And stories tied to the underlying baseline of horror's hold over the human audience. Tall tales, folklore, and history are passed down from generation to generation, and while the epic tales of heroes and myths are still lauded and celebrated, it's the tales of mortal terror that we still share with equal parts intensity and delight around warm campfires and on dark and stormy nights. Horror is very much a language that is understood by all. Love it or hate it, you must appreciate the timelessness of it. Universal Studios was one of the earliest film studios to capture the essence of that timeless appeal. Beginning in 1923 with The Hunchback of Notre Dame, more of a grand-scale historical drama, yet a monster was front and center in the film. 2 years later, the same actor that starred as Quasimodo, the misshapen bell ringer, Lon Chaney, brought to life one of the ultimate terrors of the silent era, the Phantom of the Opera. Universal was on a roll. Audiences couldn't get enough, and with the invention of sound and film in the late 1920s, it was time for horror to find its roots in the talkie era. Dracula was the first feature-length pure horror film that featured sound. Bela Lugosi starred as the exotic Count, terrifying audiences with his hypnotic and intense gaze. Universal had struck gold and rushed to find its next big sensation. Released 9 months later, Frankenstein is one of the most beloved films of all time, horror or otherwise. Boris Karloff played the misunderstood monster, becoming a star overnight. These two films ushered in a profitable and monstrously successful golden age of horror that other studios attempted to emulate. There were some great films from those studios that followed suit, yet none could quite capture the lightning that Universal did. For the better part of the next 2 decades, Universal Studios monopolized the horror and monster genre. Stars rose and faded into obscurity, but today they are all recognized and loved. Like the sweeping sands of ancient Egypt, the Universal monsters are timeless. In 1932, Karloff the Uncanny brought another unforgettable monster to life, the Mummy. Horror films exploded through the early 1930s, with many other noteworthy titles such as The Invisible Man in 1933 and The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. Times shifted and interest waned. For a time, the monsters and horrors of the big screen were retired. But just like the infamous monsters, the films would resurrect time and time again. The 1940s brought the son of silent screen legend Lon Chaney to the scene. Lon Chaney Jr. thrilled as the Wolfman, one of Universal's monsters not based upon a literary source. The wartime era saw a massive uptick in the production of horror films. Lower budget B-movies kept new films on screens and audiences in seats. The monsters were more popular than ever. This led to the first cinematic universe in the history of cinema. Frankenstein's monster, Count Dracula, and the Wolfman crossed over in multiple films fans refer to as the Monster Mash series. Still, the interest in the supernatural creatures could only last for so long. As the 40s drew to a close, the sci-fi era boomed to life in the 1950s. Aliens and spaceships thrilled audiences, and monsters based upon evolution jumped forth from the big screen in 3D, like Creature from the Black Lagoon. The 50s wrapped up the atomic age of the monsters, and new monsters and horror films faded away at Universal Studios. Still, the giant-sized footprint the monsters had left simply made its first step. There were lifelong fans that had lived through each era of films, and new fans discovered them for the first time, with re-releases in the 1960s, and the rise of fan magazines like Famous Monsters of Filmland. Hammer Studios kept the monsters alive through the 1970s, and it wouldn't be long until home video exposed another generation of fans to the now classic horror films. Soon, remakes began to rise. The 1990s revived The Mummy, and Universal would continue to produce different remakes in various levels of success. Just this year, in 2024, Universal released Abigail, with a slate of films planned for the future, including a remake of The Wolfman, due for release in January 2025. The monsters will never die. Regardless of how you feel about the newer films, we'll always have the original, monumental classics to enjoy. Nothing can take away the magic of the early films. They have made an everlasting mark upon the history of cinema and pop culture, and paved the road of the horror genre as we know it. The goal of this podcast is to showcase the wonderfully rich history of the Universal monsters and present it in a streamlined, detailed, and accurate way. There's plenty to unpack and share, countless filmmakers, writers, actors, and artists to showcase. The monsters in films are an absolute passion of mine, and I feel it is my duty to honor the legacy of some of the greatest films of all time. But where should we start? What laid the groundwork? We'll begin with some of the greatest stories ever put to paper, Authors like Shelley and Stoker, Hugo and Leroux. That is where the monsters truly came to life. This episode of the Monster Archives was written and produced by me, Ian Bates. For more on the Monster Archives, including scheduling updates and news, be sure to follow at Universal Studios Monsters on Instagram. And thank you for listening.